What's up, everybody? It's Mike. We're back here on the Pitch Please podcast. Today, I've got Kevin. We're talking to Kevin from Humi, the all-in-one left-to-right platform helping Canadian companies specifically solve employment and everything that comes with that from start to finish. Kevin, welcome to the show. Why don't you start by kicking us off with a quick introduction about yourself and a little bit about your background before Humi and what kind of got you to here?
Sure. First off, it's great to be here, Mike. Appreciate you having me on the show. It's an honor. A little bit about my background. So I've been building companies for a little while now. About 15 years of like building tech VC backed specifically companies, but really been an entrepreneur my entire life. Like lemonade stands as a kid, all sorts of like small little hustles throughout university, high school and university. As I was in grad school, I built a handful of standalone web-based businesses
Okay.
that were kind of like preempted me trying to do a bigger VC back thing, which preempted me to do another big VC back thing. And so here we are 15 plus years into building companies formally. And I guess that's kind of who I am at this point.
What's like the wildest hustle through like elementary school, high school, university? Lemonade stand could be it, but I feel like if you're like a serial entrepreneur, there's got to be something cooler in there.
We used to go around collecting empties from bars
Okay.
like at 3 a.m. after like the entire city had gone to sleep. And there were a whole bunch of little hustles like that were super fun. I used to do with buddies, and I think have preempted in a lot of ways the stuff we do today. I think a lot of the like company building is like needs to be driven by an excitement to accomplish something with some group of people.
Yeah, it's cool. What like if you were to go all the way back, is there something that sort of primed you or someone you looked up to that sort of made you very entrepreneurial? Because I find with people that like started from that lemonade stand and
Mhm.
then it just kind of like ripple effect to they've been serial founders or successful founders. Was there anything that sort of kicked that off for you as a kid?
Yeah, I think both my parents were pretty entrepreneurial.
Uh-huh.
So my father's a physician, my mom's a dentist, but like my mom has run an independent practice for 40 years, which she's built, from the ground up herself. My dad, most doctors don't have entrepreneurial endeavors, and he had a whole bunch on the side alongside his medical career. And hearing them talk about those things and growing up, I'm sure had a massive influence on what I am today.
So you tried a bunch of these different scenarios of things. You said like web, standalone websites, all these things. What sort of inspired Humi, or like what was that tipping point into getting this started, and specifically in the payroll and employee management and hiring space, and why specifically Canadian companies? I think that's like an interesting choice, not in a bad way, but we specifically started by focusing on Canadian companies too on this podcast. So I want to understand it.
Yeah, so a confluence of a couple things. The company I built before Humi was a social mobile. It was effectively Clubhouse, but
Okay.
close to a decade earlier. And
Okay.
if it's a social media mobile app, most of those businesses, if not like all of them, are lottery tickets. There's a ton of them out there. A couple of them become Instagram, Snapchat, you name it. But most of them tend to not work out over time. And through the experience of building that for 4 to 5 years, I had this like deep desire to be evaluated on the growth of revenue, not some bullshit vanity metric I'd made up.
Yeah.
Like none of those companies are really revenue generating. And at the time, SaaS was just coming of age, and Gusto and Zenefits at the time were the fastest growing SaaS companies ever. And the more I learned about SaaS through case studies about those companies, the more I got inspired by the value proposition that they provided. They support the country's most important class of employers, SMBs. In Canada, it's like 80+% of every working Canadian is at an SMB. And that in confluence, sort of almost dental practice, I actually managed and worked within it for a number of years and inside of another of other businesses, and could see the like, you can have a great business idea, you can have great timing, but if you don't have good people and you don't treat them well, the thing's not going to work. And so, like, it's hard to understand the importance of people, and understanding that if you could support them better, businesses as a whole are going to function better. Um, you know, those two things coming together at the same time, and believing I could build a venture scale business specifically doing this in Canada, which was, that was an important component for me. That was kind of like the impetus to start Humi. The idea that similar to how Shopify and can enable entrepreneurs and small business owners by giving them this magical black box that effectively takes a business and makes them a great merchant. We can do the same thing for companies where we give them this like magical black box that can take care of everything that's required that helps them solve employment. And as a result, makes them a better business. And there's so many different components to hiring people. It's like abiding by the ESA in Canada and processing payroll correctly and doing like onboardings and recruiting. The list is kind of infinite. So there's like a never-ending set of problems there inside a class of customers that it's just so much fun to sell to companies who are local, to understand and know the brands as opposed to just being a like multinational software provider, with customers that you probably are never going to interact with or
Yeah.
see when you like walk down the street.
So is your background like, other than kind of some work that you were doing at your mom's dental practices, and are you like more of a technical co-founder from start? Do you have background in like HR and employer? Or was this just like, hey, you were
Not,
kind of technical and then dealing with these pains real time and like every other entrepreneur's brain, just like, how could I make this better?
yeah, it was more the latter of like someone who can just figure shit out. So, my dad's a doctor, I was a dentist. At one point, they're like, do whatever you want, one of these two. So I went through dental school and had become a dentist.
Okay.
Since spent 4 years in dental school, and even through there was like very entrepreneurial.
Oh shit. So this is a huge pivot.
This is yeah, I mean, seemingly a huge pivot, but I look back and sometimes wonder if those years were wasted. I think in the early 20s and like those post university years, there's a like learning how to like work hard and like very focused that like whether you go to dental school or you do private equity or consulting or like there's a whole slew of things that just forces you to work really hard. Material is a number of skills that are very helpful in building businesses if you're stupid enough to take the risk in like pursuing in building companies.
So that kind of leads us up to Humi. Obviously, there's a bit of problem solving, a bit of hard work. Maybe before we even dive into Humi, just like the landscape of employee,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I think we're starting to talk about it now, and I almost want to wind back to the broader landscape, just so people don't think this is like, oh, well, I can just post my resumes on LinkedIn hiring, and that's what Humi does. No, like we'll unpack the platform concept, but like,
Mm-hmm.
what's this landscape of who plays in this? What are all of the components that companies either should be thinking about or definitely are managing, and maybe they're just not chunking it out in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's highly dependent on the type of company you have and the size that you're at. So the core things that everybody needs, everybody has to recruit employees to join a company. They need to onboard them and have like proper contracts. And then they need to be able to pay those people and track their work in a way that's compliant with the country's rules, whether it's overtime rules or time off rules. Those things have to be tracked in some way, shape, or form and reported on. And then also like if you offboard somebody, there's a whole bunch of responsibilities that need to be taken care of for tax filings, for notification of the government that are really important functions in employing people. But they aren't things that any entrepreneur or business owner should need to like spend time learning or building systems around. But I think the promise of SaaS is like, $5 to $10 per month it allows you to solve a whole host of problems without ever having to think about them. So those are the core. And then you add on performance management. So this obviously looks radically different depending on the company you're at. Some companies do goal setting through systems like ours and do reviews. Other companies will use a software like ours to track hours or to like even schedule work hours in their employee bases. So there are a whole host of hourly based workforces across the country, like restaurants or retail operations or manufacturers where clock in, clock out and shift swapping and schedule creation are very important components as well. The surface area of the product is very broad. It is also very dependent on how big your company is. A company in the same industry that is 30 versus 30 people versus 100 people versus like 500 people, like the way you interact with the system, your requirements are going to be very different.
On the back of that, what's the spectrum of size of company that's sort of the sweet spot for using Humi? Because as you talk through all those different things, I'm imagining probably similar to some of the listeners right now, like point-based solutions. You know,
Mhm.
there might be a company with an A that people think of when they think of just
Exactly.
payroll, or
Yes.
they may think of
Yes.
just I build a resume in a Word document and I post it on, different career forums. But what's the sweet spot? And then what is the benefit of having all this in one platform? And are you replacements to those things by simplifying it? Is that sort of the concept here?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's often the case that people use some of the solutions I just mentioned, but not all. So almost every company has something that needs to process payroll. There aren't a ton of companies still using check, although definitely are some. ADP and Ceridian still do like the overwhelming amount of payroll in Canada, and their products are like pretty old and stodgy. On the HR side, there are a handful of standalone products, but a lot of companies use email and spreadsheets and pen and paper. And then there are a whole host of applicant tracking softwares like Lever, Greenhouse, and Jazz. There's a whole bunch on the performance management side, like Seven Geese and Lattice and Culture Amp. If you bring them all together and you have a single source of truth, it just simplifies all the work of reconciling those systems and allowing them to talk and work together. And so it kind of gives that business superpowers, wherein like a massive enterprise, like I'm sure Microsoft uses some version of Workday. And even though it's like awful to use, it creates some like really important synergies in like being able to like leverage multiple systems at the same time. We effectively give those capabilities to small and medium-sized companies without the awful user interface or experience.
Well, even just like Microsoft hat on, as you're saying all of those things, I'm just hearing tech sprawl. And that is not the shit you want to get into as like anything that's not a large enterprise. And even a large enterprise, ideally, you don't want to get into tech sprawl, because if you just try to solve every one thing perfectly, at some point someone changes something and you get a crowd strike on your hands. But
Yeah, exactly.
you
If
just you
you're
don't want these things to have to speak, right?
100%. If you're less than a 100-person company, you want one simple spot where you can onboard a person and that person is automatically on payroll, automatically the benefits plan. Their time off is being tracked very simply and like all like in central place. All their documents are in this simple, like easy to access spot. All these things, little advantages compound. At the same time, there's a ton of risk to not manage these things well. If you don't remit taxes properly, if you don't track time off, the risk and potential cost to a business can be massive. So just having them, handled well for a simple like monthly cost is pretty high value for a lot of companies.
That makes sense. So what's like the lower threshold of like the smallest business that should start considering looking at Humi? And maybe it's two people, I don't know. And then what's sort of like the upper threshold, if there is one, in terms of like where this starts to maybe chip against the top end of what makes sense for a Canadian company to be considering?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the lower end, depends on the business, but once you get outside the business being like just a couple of family members or a couple of friends, where they're just paying themselves or they're just having a couple of contractors, if you're actively hiring and terminating people, I would say for sure once you get north of five, if there's any
Okay.
sort of regular turnover within the employee base. And then on the higher threshold, it really depends on the use case. Some are simpler, some are more complex. But once you start to look much more like an enterprise size company, that's where things tend to deteriorate.
Okay.
Where we stop
And
being
we're
a good
talking like
fit.
Canadian enterprise, like north of 5,000 people type thing.
Yeah, like once you get north of 1,000, you
Okay.
should probably be looking at like a SAP, Success Factors, or Workday, or
Okay.
God forbid, ADP has a massive enterprise product if you have to do that.
And I think that's good because it gives like a sweet spot of where you're focusing. So all in one platform, so it eliminates tech sprawl. Um, Now you don't have to name them, but is there competitors also offering an all-in-one platform, and versus competitors or versus those other things beyond all-in-one platform? Like, what are some of the key things that are really different about Humi?
Yeah, it's interesting. So for a long time, we had like this nice little head start of there not really being another comprehensive all-in-one that was like modern and focused on like SMBs in Canada. There are a couple fast-growing, well-funded ones out of the States. So like we saw Ripple launch in Canada not too long ago. A very clear differentiator between them and us. We're exclusively focused on Canada. So we continue to add features and benefits that will compound for Canadian companies. One interesting one that we just launched is the ability to produce a shred claim from your employee system of record. And as a result, we can aggregate one more service provider, we can reduce the cost, we can improve the service. We can integrate your health benefits into your onboarding flow and have those now attached to payroll. It's a huge benefit. A company like Rippling, where Canada's their 12 priority, they've already outsourced this to like third parties. You're dealing with a third party who interacts with the third party. It just naturally materializes in a whole bunch of mistakes. And
Got it. So like
it
pillar
constantly
one, like if you are a Canadian company, full stop, that is your bread and butter. Humi is focused on Canadian companies first and foremost. It's not a secondary or tertiary product feature on something that's actually focused or built for the US market. So that in itself is huge because you're building for the nuances of Canada. Sorry to kind of jump in there, but that's like so compelling as anyone that's listening. Obviously, our listenership has beyond Canadian listeners, but if you're a Canadian company, full stop, pause, you're gonna have to check this out.
this is I think this is akin to once upon a time everyone used to ask, like VCs would ask startups a question of like, what if Google does your thing?
Yeah.
And the truth is there's no substitution to having a deep focus on one singular thing. And ours is helping like SMBs in Canada employ people. And this is the thing that we will be better than anybody else in the world at.
So random tangent. Like I can't not take this tangent.
Yeah.
Funders have to hear your pitch and be like, Canada? Like, that's it? And I'm sure you had that time and time again, right? Like anyone that's pitching for funding, everyone kind of asks your TAM, and the answer people want to hear almost never is just Canada. Has that come up for you in like, what's like the most interesting dialogue around that? How are you thinking about that? Obviously, I
Yeah,
see the value for sure, but there's financial implications probably to making decisions like that, right?
absolutely. So it's a very specific choice I've made and have like had stayed firm on for a long time. During pitches, because it can be something that splits people, I put it up front and make
Okay.
sure it's like something that people have conviction in. Uh, it's quite interesting. In Canada, most of our industries are monopolies or oligopolies. And so there's a pretty strong case to be made that what we're going after also becomes that. There's a clear path to $100 million plus in Canada, but also the companies that win locally and build strong foundations tend to do really well in expansion. So, if you go walk around New York, most of the banks are going to be TDs or RBCs. So, that's not a mistake. That exists because they have such a strong base at home that it allows them to do really well in secondary and tertiary markets. Truth is that like past 100 or a couple $100 million in revenue, being a couple years away, it's hard to tell what the right next step is for us. But we always pitch our path to being sustainable, like really impactful company as being focused in Canada.
And so are you guys are venture backed or bootstrapped? What's the background on that?
We are venture backed. So we bootstrapped the first year and a half of our existence. Then we got into YC. We did a seed in graduating from YC. We raised a Series A 2 years after that, and then a Series B 2 years after that, which was about 2 years ago.
I think that's cool because I think there's like some founders that probably just need to hear the conviction around it actually being okay to have your TAM as Canada, if it makes sense, and not
Mhm.
having to just like by default say it's the globe or America or whatever, because there are ways to get venture backing with the right partners for a Canadian focused solution. And I think it's a question some people ask, right? Like by default,
Yeah,
when you're in like incubators, like, oh, like that's your TAM, and that like, you got an advisor and you're like fresh new founder, like going through all the clinics, and they're like, no, you got to make your TAM number bigger and no one's going to pay for this. The answer is you
yeah.
can.
I think you got
You
to fight
can.
through the bullshit of like, is it Canada or not? And get to the like real question of like, is there a venture return here? Is there a
Yeah.
path to a venture return through that strategy that you put forward? Focusing on Canada is certainly not the right strategy for every company. Like for us, there's certain modes that exist. Like launching a payroll service here takes a couple of years.
Mm.
Being a nationally licensed benefits brokerage, it's something that doesn't translate to other countries, and it is restrictive for a competition company. And so we're able to tell a really strong story around getting to hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue in Canada. But yeah, I definitely fell victim to the idea of just like reading TechCrunch and thinking like, hey, everyone else does seed ABC. I should just be doing the same thing. Being very like thinking critically about your business and the underlying drivers of it, and being very intellectually honest when going to market, especially when fundraising. I think it's really important finding the right capital partner.
Yeah, it's interesting because the story of so many Canadian startups, like I said, this podcast started just talking to Canadian founders. And if you were to go back and listen to, I don't know, we're like 85 or 90 episodes. If you were to go listen to all of those, they aren't your typical like Bay Area YC Combinator. They're not, this is not the acquired podcast. This isn't always just these like $1 billion stories. The journey of Canadian companies actually has been quite different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are some realities to take in. And I also think they're like more, I mean, to each their own, but like the amount of companies that make themselves into not unicorns, but like Fortune 50 companies on some horizon is fewer and fewer. And so this focus that you shared around, yeah, you want to grow. There's a need to equally focus on your profitability as a company and your ability to capture market size that's still meaningful are priorities sometimes. And I think you should really think about what you're building and do it for the right
Mm-hmm.
reasons, which is a cool position. And I'd love to hear it from a successful Canadian
Well, I
startup
mean,
focused on Canada, right?
in quotes, we're on our way, but maybe not there yet. So I think the thing that gets conflated, the thing that why San Fran-based startups have done so well is leverage, like doing high leverage financings, like finding points in time where you can just amass a ton of capital in really friendly terms. And that naturally exists in that ecosystem and much less in Canada. So some of the better success stories that I don't think get told nearly as much are like the point click cares or like the Intellexes, the companies that were like that grinded to get to hundreds of millions of revenue, wherein the founders own like the lion's share of the company. Like those are the things that are really inspiring locally that I've seen.
That's a good shout
Um,
out. So I'm gonna have to call up Mike from Point Click Care and be like, "Hey,
yeah,
we
yeah,
need you on
yeah.
the
Like
pod. We need your story to inspire Canadians."
honestly, like God bless Catch and like everybody else, the people who get to scale owning like 5% or sub 5% of the company, like it's an impossible, it's an awesome thing, but being able to like still own and control your company at that scale is incredible. And so few people have done it. More people should know the point click care story. So yeah, I highly encourage. I will be the first listener on that
All
podcast when it
right,
happens.
I'll shoot my shot and see what Mike says. See if he wants to help inspire some Canadian companies because his story is super unique. Um, Platforms, it's obviously going to be hard for us to break down like every little bit of the platform elements of Humi, and we're not here to like pick apart the product. But if you had to say like, hey, here's like two or three things people should really know about the elements of the platform that would benefit them as small businesses, either currently today or future and roadmap where you're going. Obviously, if you're a Canadian company, boom, light bulbs on. I'm like listening and paying attention. What are some of the other elements here that people should know about how you are building Humi up until this point and maybe even moving forward?
Yeah, what stands out? So fairly recently, we started off being a really great solution for white collar like office type environments, and as a result, have a ton of innovative technology companies who are part of the platform. We always want to like improve a company's ability to hire, and we in the last 6 months have launched a shred product, so an R&D tax credit to allow companies to effectively put together their claims from the information that lives within the system at
Oh,
a like
wow.
much reduced rate to outside consultants, which is a like really cool thing that is launched in the last little bit.
And so
honestly,
that
like
leverages the footprint of the existing things already in the platform instead of having to start from scratch to gather the information to even write such a shred
exactly. So a great
application.
analogy, a lot of companies use Carta to do their 409As,
Yeah.
but once upon a time, you had to engage an outside consultant. They didn't have access to the underlying data, and they were kind of expensive and a pain in the butt to work with. I think the analogy is pretty close to what we want to do with R&D tax credits. We have access to the vast majority of the data. We can make the service much more accessible and less expensive. And so it's a product we want to provide to people. And there are a whole bunch of services like that that are appended onto that are part of employing people in Canada that over time we will continue to integrate with the product. Health benefits is a great example. It's been core to our company from day one. You know, in a lot of ways, benefits in Canada are kind of a commodity. Every single provider kind of like has the same like structured plan. The pricing is very similar. The administration of it is where we can really stand out. When a company gets to be 30, 40, 50 people, every time you onboard somebody, every time they have a kid or they have a salary change, it necessitates an update in the insurance system. So, multiply that many employees times that many events, it creates an incredible amount of work and a huge surface area for risk. Because if you mess that up, there's a whole bunch of liability the company takes on. One of like the better features of Humi is that is all automated and part of like hiring and employment flow within Humi. So that's the other thing that's quite exciting. That is a benefit to like the vast majority of the companies who are on.
Do you equally have things around performance development, employee, like, I don't know if it's employee signals or like anonymized feedback? Is that sort
Yeah.
of built into this
So
too?
we have feedback, we have surveys, we have performance management where you can set goals, track them, and then
Oh,
package
wow.
them as part of
So
a
everything's
review.
there. So you've got the
Yeah,
employee from intake all the way through, and everything's kind of brought together. You're not having to go into
exactly. So
multiple
there's a
systems.
training tracking that is an important facet of a lot of people's businesses.
Okay.
If you require specific type of license for your employee base, and that needs to be renewed on an annual
Like
basis.
upload of your license,
Exactly. So it like uh, on a recurring basis can
like
ask for that.
healthcare as an example.
Healthcare, like if you require like a certain type of driver's license, or you need to do CE credits as like in an accounting function. There's a whole different like there's a whole bunch of examples of where like you can track some version of training is important, or tracking assets also happens within Humi. You hire somebody, you're going to send them as a software company, you probably send them a computer, some equipment, um, and to have those tracked underneath their profile and not need a like separate spreadsheet or a third party system to do it. Again, it's like
Yeah.
every one of these little things that we package into the platform saves administrators and the people within the company time that's better spent on the company itself. So like
So
to
and
be
there's a company portal then, but there's also an employee endpoint
Yeah,
engagement,
exactly.
web
So
or mobile, I
an
guess.
employee logs in to, request time off, to like view all the documents that they've signed, to update their banking information. These are all changes that would have warranted some sort of administration work in the past. And I just want to make it clear, like Humi is not meant to replace HR people, but it's meant to enable them to do more high value things with their time. Like they shouldn't be spending their time reconciling spreadsheets. They should be spending their time, like improving onboarding processes, finding better people, learning how to better support the people who live within work within the company.
That
And
makes sense. So from a and we don't have to give numbers, but from a pricing perspective, I assume these are like switches of feature on, feature off, number of employees. Like how's your pricing sort of work on what you offer at Humi?
yeah, it's changed quite a bit over time. Right now, it's modular.
Okay.
It's based on the number of functions you have, but even so, it's like a pretty small, pretty marginal in cost relative to the value that it creates, and also relative to other software products. It's funny to be jealous of looking at other more niche softwares that do way less, that charge like 5, 10 times what we do, but it's in and around the like $10 per person per month.
Wow. Okay. It's very, very fair. Um, Obviously, you've had a pretty incredible journey. Like, you guys have been around since 2015. earlier?
Officially launched in 17, but we started the company like early 2016 officially.
Got it. So you had some breakthrough moments. What's like out of all of that? I like to bring up some of the not so perfect stories as well on the pod. And so along that journey, what's been like one of the challenging things that sort of you've had to work through? And maybe it is this thing we discussed about being a Canadian focused company through funding rounds, but is there something else that like that didn't go the way you had thought, or that you had to think through differently? Just for others, knowing that not every founder story is like this rocket ship story with no negatives to it, right?
Yeah, I can't imagine any are. And if they are, they're just an outlier in some crazy way. The what comes to mind when we first started the company, my co-founder Matt built the entire platform in like 8 months in getting us to launch by himself. And so, as you would imagine, like within a year or so, as we started to scale, everything needed to be rebuilt. And in rebuilding the platform, we had to scrap the entire thing and start all over again after some number of months. That was a tough one to swallow.
You know what though? I think in that's probably an interesting learning, but not unique. Like obviously in my role at Microsoft, my previous role as well, you start to see that to do this right, you actually are never, you're not going to build the perfect product that's going to get you to scale day zero. You're going to have to either do full rebuilds or major renovations to it. Because if you spent that much time to get it perfect from the get go, you probably weren't building it fast enough to be a successful business. But it is interesting. That go back is interesting.
Yeah, it's tough because you see examples of it on both sides, right? Like Airtable, I think they lived in the cave for like 2, 3 years and then launched the product and it's gone like this. And other products have been the exact opposite, they're like, if you haven't launched and are embarrassed of it, you launched too late and have done a really good job of like being out in front with features and momentum. It's hard to really know. I think it's super dependent on point in time, like the value case, who you're selling to.
Well, and you need the feedback cycles because to pull an Airtable, like you better damn well be sure that that bet is perfect because if it doesn't slap on day zero, you're toast. Like absolutely toast.
Yeah,
You got to go back to the drawing board, right? So the co evolution of what you're building is super important.
if you're selling to Fortune 100s, you can't burn any customers. And
Yeah.
so you better be damn sure that when you're ready to like sell and implement somebody, like you're ready to sell and implement. Very different than like if you're selling to SMBs in the States, you have 10 million target customers.
Yeah.
Cool. Go ahead and burn a couple, figure shit out. But again, like what's the trade-off of that? Are you doing payroll? Is it that sensitive? Can the mistakes bring down your entire company? These are all the fun things you think through.
What's one of the most special moments along the journey so far for you?
Oh man, there's been so many. Man, like selling our first customers, processing our first dollars of payroll, surpassing $1 billion of payroll processed was really magical. Surpassing 100,000 people on the platform. It's been really cool. A whole bunch of little things. By far the best thing about this whole journey is the people got to like build it with. It's both like the toughest and the best thing, but it's by far the most rewarding. It's the relationships and the time spent with people building the company.
It's a good thing that you focus on people and enjoy the journey with the
Yeah,
people, which
yeah,
is
there we
cool.
go.
Any piece of advice that sort of you've received, or maybe just advice you've kind of built up over your time that you think is going to be useful for anyone else? Maybe not just founders and builders, but even people working within startups, right? I think they equally need to be motivated on the journeys that they're on, different than people working in larger corporations, right? Any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So trust is just so important to everything, but it's so incredibly like intangible, so going above and beyond for a customer or a colleague or somebody, just for the sake of it, almost always has a net positive results. Even if they don't repay it, like you do that on the whole, like it'll come back in spades. In like, if you build trust, you can move quicker in a lot of ways. If you build trust, it gives you all sorts of interesting network effects and benefits that you like in the future that you could never quantify or know at a time. So I would say like just generally be nice, operate with good intentions, and like try as much as possible to like be working on the building trust thing with everybody around you from day one, because it certainly is a dance. Like you can't just give people full trust, and you can't be completely skeptical and go to zero. You need to find your equilibrium where like you're able to set your gut and then invest it in and understand like when not to invest in it.
So speaking of people and trust, I think, we can't not at least bring the word AI into this conversation at least once.
Yeah.
Where do you feel or see AI playing into either the roadmap of what you guys are building or the disruption of the industry and how people think about managing the life cycle of employees within their organizations?
Yeah, it's interesting. We have such a broad product that there's so many interesting applications of AI. Just in the reporting function itself, being able to ask a question of the system and have it generate like an image or a report or like suggestions is really interesting. Inside of the recruiting funnel, being able to sort of filter, even like in the org chart and the like pay bands, the ability for like there's so many little places where AI could effectively do the same thing we're already doing for administrators, like really compounding the superpowers that they have to manage their business. It's hard to say what may be the killer use case for employee system of record in the future. I'm sure like everybody has thoughts, but nobody really knows at this point.
Yeah,
Um,
I do like the piece you said there though, the connectedness of your platform by definition lets you have a very holistic view of an employee and your entire workforce that you can sort of garner insights and better reduce some of the administration around things you should know or don't know
mhm.
across that, which is really cool. It's funny because there's like a spectrum, but I'm always just curious in like what people would double down on as they build. But I'm not sitting on it, so don't worry, I don't actually have it. But if I were to drop an extra like half a million or $1 million into Humi today, what would be the things that you would prioritize and invest in?
Oof, I would drop that into product. Yeah, there's just so many interesting things to build. If you look at our product as is, just like incremental improvements to the core functionality make a big difference into like the number of companies that we can service. But then there are like really exciting things like earned wage access, which I would love to build into the system. Like the ability for people to pull their paychecks daily after they've earned them, or even like in advance of that would be extremely cool. I think that systems like ours should be connected to people's group RRSPs. So I would love to build that connection wherein like not only does it help you allocate money directly to your group RSP from your paycheck, maybe it makes intelligent suggestions about financial management based on like what we know about your employment past and what we like believe is likely in the future in conjunction with whatever we know about your underlying financial situation. Those to me, this stuff around getting people more money effectively and simplifying their employee, there's just a whole host of ideas that I would invest in the product side.
I like it. Product. That is a key piece, and it's cool to see that you want to continue innovating that roadmap. I almost hear a Humi times Origin collab coming up around how you guys think about employees financially investing in themselves along that journey. Kevin, this has been a great conversation. It's really cool to see a Canadian born company doubling down their focus on the Canadian landscape. It's really cool to also see how you've gone through some of those decisions and that you guys are continuing to thrive and simplify the entire employee experience for people like you. It's people that are listeners of this show that are startups, but other small, medium businesses that need to have a better perspective left to right, from hiring to performance management to payroll. Really, really insightful dialogue today. So thank you for coming on. Any closing thoughts on your side before we sort of wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I hope more Canadian entrepreneurs try to do ambitious things and think really critically about how to build large, sustainable businesses in Canada.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody who tuned in. We'll put everything in the show notes. But thanks again for watching the Pitch Please podcast, and we'll catch you on the next episode.